Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. Are you doing the best for your client to help them create their legacy? Are you creating a plan that goes far beyond finances to help people ensure that it becomes the driving force behind all decisions? On this podcast, hosts Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller will help you with growing your practice and your clients' peace of mind. Together, they bring the best and brightest minds to share with you how to help your clients develop their best legacy. And now, here are your hosts, Katie Beth and Stan.
Welcome back to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. Our guest today is an HR strategist whose goal is to be a bridge builder between emerging trends and practical solutions. Nirit Cohen, thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So before we dive in, will you give our listeners, you have kind of an interesting work history and background. Will you tell our listeners a little bit about sort of your work history, your background, and then the work that it is that you're engaging in today?
Okay, sure. So I'm an Intel veteran, worked almost 30 years for Intel in finance, human resources, and mergers and acquisitions all over the world. And somewhere around 2007, I was working as an HR leader and, the smartphone came into being, wireless became more prevalent, the cloud, the tools that kind of created the cloud. And it became clear that work was going to be different. Because if you think about those days, right, pre the smartphones, work was a place that was like everything was connected to the wall. I remember the phones were connected because they were all landlines, and the computers were big and heavy screens and they were connected. And even your files were sitting, in paper on your desk or in a cupboard. So we realized that things were changing and communication became just, air, and it was there, and wireless and the cloud. And so I asked, what would it feel like to work in 2020? And so for me, 2020 for a long, long time was the future. And before I knew it was going to turn into that. And so I had started a project back in 2010 that was called the Future of Knowledge Work. And you could still dig it up on the Intel newsroom because we created a white paper that was called The Future of Knowledge Work. It's really interesting because most of it actually ended up turning out the way we thought it would. And we can talk about that if you like. And I stuck with it. And so at some point I started blogging. And my blog turned into a column in the paper when one editor called me one day and said, can you start, writing about it? Because it was really a unique topic back in 2014 when I started writing in the paper, how work was changing. And it was almost like science fiction. It was something that you brought to, a keynote you brought to strategy day. And then COVID hit. And suddenly it became the way we lived. Most of my keynotes, I needed to scrap because I no longer needed to convince people that work was changing. And that was all about what are we going to do about it? So that's what I do. I retired from Intel 6 years ago. And I work with organizations on, how work is changing. And then because I've been on this side so many years, where does it meet reality and how we need to think about it and change and, given whatever it is that we do.
What are some of the biggest changes? Obviously, 2020 was a curveball for everyone. And so your work it was very needed before that. And is still, I feel like everything is still just continuing to change. But what are some of the biggest changes that companies and businesses have really had to deal with since 2020 and COVID hit? And how did that really impact the way companies functioned?
So I think the first one that's obvious to everyone, and we talk about it a lot, but I think it's going to become a blip on the bigger picture, is work is no longer a place you go to, it's something you do, right? So we talk about remote and hybrid and, all of that, but that's just a way kind of in the bigger scheme of work being something you do. And when it becomes something you do, you can do it from home, you can do it from a coffee shop, you can do it from an office, you can do it from a customer's office, and you can also do it online. So as we look at technology getting better and the way we interact and communicate, and we're doing this video now and audio, right? But tomorrow it might feel more real, as if we're really together. And then the next day, I might even speak a foreign language and you can hear me in a different language. And so we can suddenly interact globally in ways we couldn't do before. And the more we kind of shift that, work becomes something you do, and you can do it, maybe anywhere, anytime, with whoever it is that, you should be collaborating with. And so I tell people, if it used to be your profession, your job, your employer, your business card, it becomes, what's the value you bring? Who you need to collaborate with to bring that value? Who needs it? What do they call it when they're saying, here's something I need, and then how will they know you exist?
Those are all really great questions. Do you think that this trend will continue? The virtual work trend will continue to be sort of the wave of the future, or do you see a trend where things kind of shift back and people move more towards interacting like we used to sort of in the pre-virtual days? Or is it a mix somewhere in there?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much about whether it's virtual or not. I think it's about people getting together to create value. And they used to get together under the umbrella of an employer, right? Which is what really had a building with a big logo, and you had a desk, and you had conference rooms, and you drove to get to that place. And today we get together in various ways, and not even necessarily under that, organizational structure, because now you have people out there who could do things for you, and we can get together just finding each other on different platforms. So that's another way to think about this. So suddenly it's not just kind of this whole ownership model of my employee or my team, right? It's who's the right team, and how do I access the right kind of talent, and how do I engage them, and how do we work effectively? So the more technology helps us break down the barriers of time and space, the more we'll be able to do that, regardless of whether we're together in an office or not. So I don't think it's just about hybrid, yes or no, or remote work, yes or no. I think we're people, we're social animals. We like to converse and do things together. Historically, for the past, about 100 and so years, to do that, we needed to get together in an office. And so we created structures, office hours and locations and org structures. Once we started pulling that apart and unbundling that, we can get together in lots of smaller ways. And we see it in the data. We even see it in macroeconomics, right? We see there's growth, but not necessarily in the form of employee, jobs and employee-employer relationships. So we see a lot of small networks of individuals, companies of one. That's work. It's just not structured the way it used to be.
Right. That makes perfect sense. I have stolen all the questions so far. Stan, what questions do you have for Nirit?
Yeah, so lots of questions. You're talking about this new way of working, and that causes me to think about the number of times in the last year or so that I've gone to someplace like Upwork or Fiverr to grab people to perform specific functions. So that sounds like part of what you're talking about, right?
Yep, absolutely. And think about how that changes the way you find them, right? So in this whole idea of a resume, which is kind of here's what I studied, here's, the jobs I did. But when you go either to a friend and say, you go to Katie Beth and say, okay, I need a guy to do the web, do you know someone, right? That's a different way to find people. And so Fiverr and Upwork is just examples of a cloud of people out there who you can interact with. And the whole way that you find work and work finds you is completely different. And this is growing. It's growing beyond, it used to be, we called it the gig economy, right? Because it was, I need some tomatoes. Somebody is in the store, they'll pick up a bag of tomatoes for me and I'll pay them, 50 cents. But that went all the way up the value change, and you can find really people they wouldn't come work for you, and frankly you don't need them full time, but you can get some of their time for a piece of work that you need to get done.
So I'm curious, now that we're not together so much in an office setting, have we lost something from that?
Yes, a really good question. And I always think about it that you go back longer, right? To when people worked in communities, and not in, they worked in agriculture and they did trade, and we didn't have the whole office, corporate structures. We got our community different. We got the people, the feeling of being together in a different place. Over the past, in our lifetime, we're used to having friends from work and social interactions at work because work was a place you went to. And so I think what's going to need to shift is also, it's not just how we work, but it's also how we live, right? So we used to have like off hours. So you went to the gym in off hours. Well, frankly, I'm not a morning person, so I can't go running at 5 a.m. It's not my thing. So what's wrong with going to the gym at 11, right? I could work, stop working, go to the gym, and come back and work, and I can work late at night if it suits my style. So it's the hours you work. And then you can say, okay, I can go have coffee at 3 with my neighbor or with a friend who I met at the gym that I didn't even know lived near me because we used to be away at work. And so how we live changes, not just how we work. In fact, I went to the Milan, I think it's a furniture exhibition, right? And I went there because I was really curious to see how home furniture is changing as a result of the fact that we brought work into the house. So suddenly you need more desks and you need more quiet spaces and you need more enclosed spaces. And it was really interesting to see how it's changing the home, not just the office.
Yeah. So I want to drill into this some more because I've been thinking a lot about, and not just in our own organization here, but with our clients and people that we know, the impact on the culture of a business if we don't have people assembling at the coffee machine and having, you know, conversations where they're standing next to each other, looking at each other, interacting in person with each other. What are you seeing? What tools and techniques are the innovators implementing to help build, strengthen corporate culture when the team members are no longer in close proximity to each other? I'm really curious to hear what you're learning about that.
One really interesting thing to understand is that some of these things have been around for a really long time. They just weren't everybody's to experience. So we're having this conversation, and you guys are in the US, and I'm physically in Israel. And I worked for Intel for 3 decades. So for me to interact with my coworkers, and frankly, I managed global teams. So frankly, for me to interact with my employees for a really long time, I needed to learn to build that relationship through other tools, right? Whether it's Zoom or, so video or audio. And once in a while we'd meet, but, either I would travel or they would travel or we'd get together, but it wasn't your standard coffee machine. And in fact, I needed to learn to build trust with my managers and get them to agree to things the way that you usually do around the coffee machine, right? But I needed to learn to do it a different way because I wasn't there every day, right? So what's happening now is that those leaders, and you're actually seeing this even if you look at the headlines and there's a whole return to work conversation going on. And we've got headlines about usually executives wanting more people, more time at the office. And it's been going on for really, I think it's about a couple of years now. And sometimes companies are drawing lines in the sand and then they're moving them again because employees are not cooperating, right? They're not going to go back to the future. It doesn't work that way, by the way. So basically what's happening is whoever's in executive roles, right, got there a certain way. It's really hard for us to change how we go about building trusts and relationships. But what got us here is not going to get us to the next phase. The people that were already in the periphery, they're feeling more comfortable because they've always had to figure out a way to do this without, meeting at the coffee machine.
Let me ask you, I'm curious, because I know you think about this and you've thought about this a lot and you've written blog posts and you give speeches on it. You've written a book, although I understand your book has not been translated from the Hebrew into English yet. But I'm really curious, if we were having this conversation 10 years or maybe 20 years from now, what changes do you see coming that have not really materialized yet? How will the world be different from how it is now, 10, 20 years from now?
So I'm wondering how uncomfortable I'm going to make you if I really answer that question.
I'm sitting down.
You know, it's always helpful to look back, right? And I'm thinking, well, if we go back to 2006 and I would describe a world where you walk around with a tracking device, right, that knows where you are, who you're talking to, what your interests are, would you agree? And you probably would have said no, right? But then the smartphone came and it gave you WhatsApp and it gave you Spotify, it gave you YouTube and it gave you Facebook. I gave you Google Maps, and then you said, okay, you know what? I'll take it. I'm paying the price. And I'm comfortable with this idea that I have this tracking device, and maybe I don't want to think about it. And so if you look forward, right, we've got these really big forces that are changing not just the way we work, but the way we live. And I said to someone recently, it's think about it like the before and after the smartphone. They said, well, okay, but now add a whole bunch of zeros to how much more it's going to be drastic, right? So the future isn't a nicer iPhone. The future is a lot of things are currently impossible and unthinkable that will become day to day, like, we have seen in our lifetime already in terms of transformation. And so it comes from technology. But what's really interesting is it's not just technology. It's the way people change their contracts with work and life and the way they want these things to interact. So if in our world being a good worker was talking about how hard we work and our long hours, and I'd wear it like a badge of honor. I'd say things like, wow, I had a meeting at 11 p.m. and it was like you'd be proud of it. We're seeing a change in the contract and the social contract around work. And you see it on so many fronts where people are basically saying, you know what, I don't want to build my life around the work. I want to build my work into my life. And that has huge implications. And so we touched on this really small example that's maybe big, but it's happening these days, which is people are not willing to go back to 5 days in the office, regular hours, right? They want something different because they discovered it was possible. And I think that's just the beginning of a change that will really redefine how we think about work and the social contract around success and how much is enough. I call it the future of work starts with life. And I think that's going to be a very big change in what we will see and what people are willing to do. And then I think on top of that, clearly, knowledge is aging really quickly. So if in our lifetime, you went to study, you went to school, you got a profession, and it would hold about 30, some years of career. First of all, careers are going to be more than double that now. And plus knowledge is aging so quickly. Whatever I studied in the 20s, I'm really good at a lot of things nobody needs anymore. And so you need to learn, unlearn, relearn so many times that you don't even define yourself by a profession that is the same, throughout your lifetime. And so that changes a lot as well.
Does this mean that fewer and fewer people will be, in a traditional sense, an employee and have a different definition of the relationship between the work they do and the company they work for?
Yeah, we're already seeing that. We're seeing an increase. First of all, we're seeing for quite a few years now, people who are working something, even if they're salaried employees, are doing something in addition to that. And that's kind of up to almost, I think, half in the US, it's about half the population. The working population is doing something on top. It's being called the 1099 economy. So it's like, it could be something like I'm an accountant by day, and I do tax reports for friends by night, which, is the same thing. But I could also be an accountant by day, and I do pottery and I sell it on Etsy, right? So it's like the full range. But one of the interesting things is last year we saw for the first time an increase in self-employed who are 100% independent, right? So we're seeing this shift. And if you think about your career going from 30 years to about 60 years, because think about it, we live longer, right? You start at your 20s, retirement is no longer one kind of day you go from full kind of work mode to doing nothing. So you start wanting to maybe do other things and maybe work a little less. And frankly, that's true for other times during our lifetime, right? You can decide you want to focus more on your family for a while. You can decide you want to go learn something new because knowledge is aging for a while. And so this whole idea that you go in and out of work modes and that you work in different capacities over different periods, that's going to be normal. So we'll see a lot. That's what my book's about. It's really the shortening life cycle. And so as people, we need to learn to recognize when our life cycle, kind of the one we're on right now, the career life cycle is going to decline and then start shifting towards the next one.
So I get all that, but I guess if I focus on that retirement piece, what you're saying, I think, is that there's an emerging redefinition of what retirement is. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If we really look at this, we look at the life cycle the way it used to be divided into 3 phases, right? You had like up to the end of your 20s, you studied a profession and kind of got yourself this title that was then between your 20s and, your 60s, you worked, which was your career. And then you kept saying, one day I'll play. So I'll, retire and do all the stuff I never got around to doing. And I've saved enough, or in some countries, somebody's going to pay for it, right? That model is gone. It's gone because you can't assume you learn in your 20s that will hold you. You can't assume you're going to work only 30 something to 40 years. And I don't think you can assume that you can work 30 years, save for 30 years of non-work. So this idea that retirement, or that one day you'll get to do all this stuff that you never got around to doing because you worked really hard. This goes back to my concept of the changing contract of what work is within life and the other way around, because people know they need to learn, work, and play all the time because it's not 3 different stages of life.
Are you finding that there's along with what you just said, that there's an emerging need for a greater sense of purpose in what we do?
Yeah, we're seeing the why of work as a very big driver. We're frankly also for young people. And so it started out being kind of midlife career changes where people said, now I'm going to make a change and now I want to do something that matters. But now we're seeing it, and even for young people, right? They're basically say, I want to do something that matters, period. And so purpose is becoming a very big motivator. In fact, I talk about the motivational paycheck a lot with organizations. So if you think about all the things why people choose to do certain things and not do others, and it's not necessarily because of money. It's because of other things that they get value elements, and value and what I believe in, or the impact I have on the work or my society. Those are really important things.
Well, that's, in my judgment, a hugely positive trend that we can celebrate.
I agree.
Katie?
For sure. Okay, one last question for you before we run out of time. You touched on this briefly earlier, but how do you see the shift that we're going through? And the shortening life cycles of how long that's good and all of these things. How do you see this shift really affecting our education systems? My whole life and before that, you grow up, you go to school, you go to university, you get your degree in whatever it's going to be, mathematics, engineering, the medical field, the law field. And then that's your training. You've done your years of training. You go to law school, you go to medical school. And then as you touched on, that information is very quickly changing and becoming obsolete. You're not prepared for a lifelong career anymore. How is that going to impact our education systems, and how will we be able to adapt to really deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really big question.
It is.
Yeah. And I think, first of all, we're already seeing this in the data, right? I mean, we're seeing people ask themselves questions about whether they should go, invest in school. So I know in the US, going to school, higher education is very costly. And so this idea of, we used to bear that cost because it will have the returns that they would be directly related. And that's no longer necessarily the case. But we're seeing this globally. And even if we think about COVID, when suddenly COVID forced education to become remote, then basically I say, okay, if I'm learning through a video, who said I need to be enrolled in this university? And who said that I need to be bound by who accepted me or where I physically live? I could just go to see the video of the person that wrote the book instead of the person that's teaching the book that the person wrote, right? So you see people starting to ask these questions. Now, learning is more important, not less important. In fact, it's so important. We need to learn all the time. We have no choice. We have to, like I said, learn, unlearn, relearn, right? So we still think that structured education teaches you to learn. So frankly, if you ask me what to go study today, I would say two things. One is something you love, because only when you study something you love, you stay relevant because you keep reading, right? Nobody forces me to read Trends on the Future of Work, but I do it because I enjoy it. So my really weird hobby became something, I make money off of. That's the first thing. If you go study because your parents told you to get a degree or because they told you it's a good profession, you'll get the degree, put the diploma in a drawer and go do something else. So there's no point. The second thing is you have to study somewhere that teaches you to study. Because frankly, give or take 5 years from whenever you're done, whatever, half of what you studied is irrelevant. And I think 5 years is being really lenient because the way AI is moving for a lot of professions, it's really fast. And I said this once in this university, and one of the professors got really upset with me, and he stood up and he said, a doctor is a doctor is a doctor, right? And so the head of medicine spoke, and she said, half of what we teach the people by the time they come in and they leave has changed. And half of the people teaching in med school today are not doctors. So what is a doctor? What's the profession? What do you need to be a doctor? So all of that's changing, and you can replace the word doctor with whatever profession you like. So I think education's going to have to figure out what their value add is. Institutions change slower than people. And so I would say to anyone listening, don't wait around for anybody to figure that out. You own staying relevant. So if in the past, your stability of employment and income was dependent on the profession you studied and the place that employed you, today it depends on you staying relevant, and that's on you.
Absolutely. I love that. And it's so interesting. One of the first employers I ever had, of course, I graduate with this new shiny degree, and I'm so proud. It's in political science and sociology. And I was so proud of this. And one of my first employers said it didn't really matter what my degree was in, because my degree is not about what I learned. It's just proof to him that I was teachable. And that always really stuck with me, and I feel like is more relevant now than it was even back then in this shifting, changing world that we live in. So great information for us. Stan, do you have any more questions for Nirit before we run out of time?
No, because we are out of time. But yeah, I can have a much longer conversation. This is terrific. I've enjoyed this time.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for listening to us. This has been the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. And our guest today was Nirit Cohen. And to get connected with Nirit, you can visit niritcohen.com, and we are actually going to link that for you in the show notes. She is a very incredible speaker and does lots of great keynotes. There's a lot of great information on her site, so be sure you visit it and check her out. And Nirit, thank you for joining us. I'm not even sure what time of night it is there for you, but thank you so much for jumping on with us. We really enjoyed getting to meet you, and thank you for sharing all of this information with us.
Thank you. It's been great.
You've been listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller. For more information on them and the show, please visit pinnaclelegacylaw.com. If you like what you've learned today, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.